we get there. Okay, from a little different perspective, recovery is what I call the autonomic nervous system dance. It's always happening. So you have the sympathetic stressors coming in, fatigue on one side. Sorry, guys, that's you. The parasympathetic is the recovery. That's the fitness. That's the building up. That's the combating. Okay? So there's a continual process to balance our system. We have stressors coming in, and for every stressor that comes in, there's a recovery response that responds to that. So we're constantly balancing back and forth and back and forth and back and forth to combat. Because if the body just got bombarded with stress after stress after stress after stress and it was never doing anything, it would pile up so huge that we'd have to have this massive response. And that's not how it happens, even though sometimes after you train a certain way, it feels like that's how it happens. That's not exactly correct. Okay? Always a constant dance. So this slide is from these next slides are going to be vitally important to understand, and we're going to put this whole thing together. Okay, so this is how it works. We have an incoming stressor. The body is now being stressed. Doesn't matter what it is. Doesn't matter if it's mental, emotional, physical, doesn't matter. Immediately, we have a fatigue response, which triggers a fitness response. This is why stress is so important. Stress creates a fatiguing response. It stresses the system to force it to have to do something to combat that, which is how we create an adaptation or the ability to get to an adaptation, and how we create a positive or fitness response is what we call it. Okay? So as fatigue starts to decrease, that's the recovery response. All right? As we recover, you'll notice that as the red line goes up towards the black line, that green line goes up higher. So there is a correlation between less fatigue equals more fitness. That's your readiness. That's how you get and understand where readiness is. When you're recovered, it's when you've gotten to the completion of the recovery process. The completion of the recovery process is when there's the best ratio between stress and fitness, and that's when you have your highest readiness, noted by the yellow dotted line right there. You'll notice that recovery never gets to zero because we're always under stress. Gravity. We can't escape gravity unless you go to the moon. Gravity is a stressor. There's always input that's coming in. So there's always a little bit of stress. We need stress to live. What happens if you take away gravity? We die. Why? Because the body needs stress to constantly keep itself active and promoting and growing. That's why as we age, things start to decrease and we no longer can do it because the stress overtakes us. We don't have the ability to manage that. So this slide right here lays the foundation. You see the recovery process, you see recovered. That recovered state gives you an optimal fitness, which is an optimal readiness, and that's your optimal point for training on a consistent basis, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Look at it another way. So think of it as stress. Looking at this image, your bucket is how much stress you can actually tolerate. That bucket's going to be different for everybody. We all have different abilities to tolerate stress. That's our capacity. The water is all of the stressors that are coming into the body. And then down there, you'll see the holes. Those are the coping strategies or our recovery strategies. That's how we get the recovery process going. If there's too much stress, or we have excessive stress coming in, water, without, this is the key, without a way to release or decrease it, we're going to exceed our capacity. The water is going to overflow, and that's when we get into a state of distress. That's when stress becomes bad, is when we can't manage it. That's the only time stress becomes bad, is when it can't be managed. Stress in and of itself isn't bad. It's the management process. If your management's poor, stress is bad. If your management's great, stress is good. Okay? When this happens, this distressed state leads to prolonged inflammation, which we just talked about in the previous slides, which is when we get exhausted, breakdown, and that's when injury will occur. That's when injury happens. Matter of fact, I've been training people using understanding training loads and heart rate variability and this process that we're going to talk about in a second on how to assess recovery and readiness. I've been using this for 15 years, and I've trained a lot of different athletes, and I've trained a lot of different people, and you can almost predict when someone's going to get injured. And actually, there's research that shows that there is a prediction. You can predict when someone's going to get injured or when they're at the highest point for risk of injury. But we're never told that in the industry. We have to dig for it. So if you take this away here, you can minimize your risk of injury, and you can help prevent it and overcome it in yourself and or those people that you train or work with. Now, too little stress, not enough incoming stress, as we talked about, coming in the bucket can be like a sedentary person. It makes us stagnant. So we don't have enough stimulation. This can also lead to distress and or injury and illness, as we've seen with sedentary. So don't think it's just too much stress, it's too little. Now, one thing to really, really take a hold of, a lot of stress on your system does not increase your risk of injury. It's not how much stress you're under, it's how well you manage it. So just because there's a lot of stress does not mean that that's bad. It's, are you able to manage that stress? So if you're a trainer, coach, or if you're some type of therapist, or you're somebody that you need to know how that person is responding. You have to be able to assess them. And there's a variety of simplistic ways that I'm going to talk about to assess how people, because everyone's going to respond to stress different. I don't care if it's a therapeutic protocol. I don't care if it's the same program. Those of you that have trained multiple athletes and you have a program that you work with, you know that some athletes, that isn't anything for them. Other athletes can't walk the next day. Why is that? It's because everyone's different. We have to train people to their level or we're going to break them. Simple as that, or yourself. Okay, so let's put all this together now. So we have the incoming stressor, and we already talked about the inflammation. When that incoming stressor hits, we go through the HPA axis, the stress response, that creates inflammation. Inflammation is the trigger for pain. So pain is caused by inflammation, and that's what creates a fatigue state. Not the pain, but the inflammation, because that's the body's immune response to what's happening. It's trying to get in and repair itself. So it's in the recovery state. That's what triggers recovery to trigger fitness. So think of the incoming stressor as all the water. So you see the water on the right-hand side. We've got inflammation coming in. Now we get to the recovery process. The body's going to automatically try to enhance its recovery or increase recovery because of the inflammation that's coming in and cleaning out all the byproducts and all the things that are happening with the stress response. Okay, so the holes in the bucket have been opened up. Recovery is starting to happen, but that's not recovered. That's just the start of the recovery process. Recovered, and that's, again, where we get readiness. Recover is when we've hit that state. So you see that red line on the right there by the bucket. Recovered is when we've got the water in our bucket below the holes. So we're not still releasing stress. We've got the water below. That's when you're recovered. What happens is if you do not know how to assess people and find out where they're at, we may think that is recovered. We may think that red line, and you can see there's still holes that are underneath that red line. So they haven't really recovered, they're still recovering. And you can see that that readiness means that they're shifted down to the left, so their readiness isn't as high as it could be or should be, depending on what you're trying to accomplish in that person or yourself. Now, you can train in this area right here, but you better know how much stress to put on somebody if they're in this state. So there are times when athletes or military personnel, or even yourself as a fitness enthusiast, depending on what you're trying to do, may train in that state. And it's okay to train in that state, but you need to know how to adjust your volume, which is the amount of stress on your training, so you don't overstress the system and end up going backwards instead of continually going forward. I hope that makes sense. If you don't know how to assess, you may think this is recovered because everyone else says, well, just wait 24, 48 hours and then you can do it again. Well, what if that's not you? What if that's not the person you're training with? You may be here. So if you have three different places, just for example, on this chart, that someone says you as a strength coach or a trainer, you as yourself, or you as a medical professional or a licensed professional says this is where somebody should start hitting it hard again, but they're at three different spots. Which one are they and how do you know? And will they get a different outcome based upon the protocol or the session that they're doing relative to where they are right now in their readiness? So I hope that makes sense. I hope you understand the importance of understanding what stress is, understanding the difference between recovery and recovered, and how that affects your readiness, your current ability level to train or to perform a specific function or task at that time. If we understood this as an industry, our military wouldn't be absolutely overwhelmed and inundated with musculoskeletal injuries. We have a contract with US Navy and we're trying to actually get this across and accomplish this, but it's still difficult because people who work with these people don't understand this. If you're a coach or trainer, if you don't understand this, you're setting your clients up for failure. Licensed professionals, same way. We need to understand this concept and not just rely on biometric information, because the biometric information has holes in it that I would love to tell you about. I just don't have time. That doesn't always do exactly what we want it to do. We have to be in tune with ourselves, and you have to be in tune with your client. That is the best way right now. Using biometrics can help support it. And I'm saying that based on experience because I've worked with a lot of different biometrics that I've used, data collection, and I've tested this with what the system says versus what the person's saying. And the person is 99% of the time right because that's what their perception is. And then it comes down to a coach's eye. It's a whole different story. So when we have all this, if we have prolonged stress, if we do not manage our stress properly, it will lead to a decrease in your results. And I don't care again what the adaptation is. It'll decrease your ability to lose weight or lose fat. And it will also increase your risk of injury. Here's a flow chart of what happens, and this is how injury actually occurs and happens. So number one, these are all scientifically supported, so I just don't have the references here. Number one, when we have prolonged stress, we have an altered immune system function. It decreases our ability to manage the stress, period. Number two, huge, inability to downregulate inflammation. This is the number one factor promoting musculoskeletal injuries. Inflammation is the number one cause of musculoskeletal injuries and most all major diseases. Number three here, inflammation, this response, and specifically inflammation, will decrease the recruitment of type 1 muscle fibers and alter muscle spindle function, which decreases stability, mobility, and overall adaptation that we're trying to create. That's a big one, specifically for musculoskeletal injuries, which is actually being correlated now to ACL injuries, which they can't seem to figure out, but they're trying to find out, because it's not just about stability training, and I'll talk about that in a second. I'm going to talk about what stability really is here pretty soon. Okay, so it decreases recruitment of type 1 muscle fibers and muscle spindles, and it also dehydrates connective tissue. The vastness of that statement is that when we decrease the ability of this tissue, the connective tissues, to stiffen, remember, your connective tissues is what transfers forces. Real quick anatomy, muscles generate force. Connective tissue transfers that force to the bone and joint. So if the muscle isn't working, type 1 muscle fibers and muscle spindles, then that's putting more stress on the connective tissue, tendons, and ligaments to try to create support. And that's not what they're designed to. They're designed to transfer, not create. So when you place more force on the connective tissue in a dehydrated state, which means it has less ability to transfer force and less ability to create stiffness, you now increase your risk of injury. And those of you that deal with injury, What's predominantly injured? Muscle or connective tissue? Connective tissue. That's why we have the injuries that we have. This summarizes why we have the injuries that we have.